Look, thank you very much. As I was thinking about the theme of this conference, it seemed to me that it brought together two impulses in Western culture and perhaps in various ways in culture universally. Impulses that are pretty consistently in tension with one another in various historical epochs, although impulses that at any given point are in play with one another. The first is what you might call the romantic. You know, the Romantic poets used to talk about their poetry being the result of the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotion. And this romantic impulse values the authentic, the emotional, the spontaneous. It is highly individualistic and highly unmasked. And its beauty, of course, is that it has an authenticity about it. And the danger of it is that it's a tremendous burden to keep up, to always be unmasked, fresh, original, emotionally present, is incredibly burdensome. I remember when my first wife died, I used to long for the liturgy of bereavement. I used to long for the liturgy of bereavement. Many people would not say anything, or else they'd be terribly uncomfortable. Because, of course, in a culture that values the authentic, they felt they had to say something original or meaningful or important or connecting. And what you wanted them to say was what a very well-educated young man said to me on Eastern Avenue at the university. He said to me, "Dr. Spence, I'm really sorry to hear about your wife." And I said, "Oh, thank you, Rupert." And he said, "If there's anything that I can do, there's probably not for your family, please just let me know." And I said, "That's very kind of you, Rupert, thank you. You wanted the liturgy of bereavement because the burden of authenticity is sometimes overwhelming." And alongside the romantic, there is, as it were, the classical impulse. It's ordered, it's rational, it's communitarian, it has its liturgies, it's formal. And of course, that also has, and that creates a safe space for people. Its great virtue is that it's safe. When Beth died, I loved praying the liturgy because it was a safe place to be. And yet, of course, it can also be highly brittle, highly artificial, highly, in that sense, false. And as I thought about those two impulses in Western culture, this impulse towards the romantic and this impulse towards the classical, with the one having both the benefit of authenticity, but the disadvantage of the burden that it is to maintain, and the other having the benefit of safety, but the tendency towards the brittle and the artificial. It made me think about my own work and being masked and unmasked, and what it means to be masked and unmasked in my role. And I think role is a good place to start to think about that. I am the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sydney. That's a role. And it's a role that it's important that I perform. And in some senses, it doesn't really matter who Michael Spence is. I am the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sydney. And I need to make it safe for people to engage with me as the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sydney. It needs to be both safe for me and safe for them. There needs to be a certain, as it were, masking, a certain conscious adoption of that role. I have a very authentic relationship with the person who is effectively, though not in theory, my boss. That is the chair of the University Senate. She's the Chancellor of the university. It's an honorary position, but she works very hard for the university, probably about 3 days a week. She is an incredibly capable person. Incredibly capable person. We're very honest with one another. We discuss both the strengths and weaknesses of the university, of my work, of our work, of how it all works together. And yet I never call her anything but Chancellor. Never. Because I know that she's there to serve the organisation in a particular role, and that she could sack me in an instant if it were the right thing for the university. There's an appropriate mask. She's the Chancellor, I'm the Vice-Chancellor. And similarly, I don't have any of my colleagues or the people who work for the university as my Facebook friends. I don't socialise with them. We don't spend time together outside work. We have great, open, friendly, engaging relationships, but I'm the Vice-Chancellor. I could sack them in an instant, and should, if it's the right thing to do for the organisation. That recognition of appropriate boundaries that we all, as it were, at one level, must and have to wear a mask, that makes it safe for everybody, because it constantly reminds people that this is an organisation in which people are playing a role, and that role comes with certain duties, obligations, and responsibilities. But at the same time, it seems to me that it is also crucial, in the kind of way that Andrew was talking about this morning, that relationships are authentic. That as well as being Vice-Chancellor, I am also Michael. That as well as being Vice-Chancellor, I am also open and honest about the things I find difficult, both in my life more generally and also at work. And in some way there's an odd dialogue between those two things, because the more formally I respect the boundaries of the role, the more open and honest I can be about who I am with both my team and more generally. It's a tricky thing to hold together, and yet it seems to me to be absolutely crucial. When people walk down Eastern Avenue wearing T-shirts that say "Fuck Michael Spence," it's really important for me to remember that they are being a part of the Education Action Group, our Trotskyist student union, that they are being a part of the Education Action Group, that they are performing a role, that they don't really mean "fuck Michael Spence," they mean "fuck the Vice-Chancellor," and that makes it safe for me. But it's also important that my relationship with my EA, my relationship with my Chief of Staff, my relationship with my with my team, my relationship with staff at the university and students more generally, both demonstrates a willingness to articulate when I was wrong, both demonstrates an opportunity to talk about my own doubts and fears about the university's work in the context of the safety of the role. And it's balancing those two things that's a constant challenge. And it seems to me, to some extent, that's true for all of us. And I suppose the question that I was thinking through this morning was, how does my Christian faith particularly prepare me for that inevitable duality that there is in a role such as mine? Public figure, Vice-Chancellor, and Michael, human being at work. How does my Christian faith prepare me for that duality? And it seemed to me that there were two ways in which my Christian faith powerfully prepares me for that duality. The first is, it seems to me that Christians are profoundly, deeply, and in important ways, inevitably hypocrites. Right? Hypocrisy, of course, is one of the great virtues as well as one of the great vices. And there's a whole political philosophy about how democracy would not be possible without hypocrisy. Because as Christians, we know that we are both profoundly broken and also being remade, and with a clear vision of what the good life looks like. And if I really had to practice what I preach, I would never preach, because it would be impossible for me to practice it. And therefore Christians inevitably and always lead a double life. We are always the old man and the new man together. And we are always struggling with the fact both that we can't practice what we preach and that our preaching is compelled and inevitable. That's something that the world at the moment finds incredibly hard to deal with because it is so in love with authenticity. It's so in love with authenticity that it believes that it is not possible to say, look, this is the right thing unless you also do it 100% of the time. And so the Christian position, this radical double and inevitable double life, this need to say both, I'm not capable of living up to this standard, and yet I will affirm that standard, is something that is inevitably a part of the Christian life. And it seems to me that that also, in some ways, grounds my ability both to say, well, yeah, as Vice-Chancellor, for the institution, this is the right thing to do. It's tough, it's difficult, scares me. In various ways I can't live up to the Vice-Chancellor I would like to be, but this is the right thing to do for the organisation and the thing that we should be doing. The second thing that I think is just ultimately liberating in this duality of playing a role that you know you can never quite live up to, of playing a role that you know that you can never quite fulfill and yet needing to fulfill it, is that ultimately my identity is grounded in the love of God. That ultimately who I am is not dependent upon how good a Vice-Chancellor is, or whether the T-shirts say celebrate Michael Spence or not. That ultimately I don't need the approval of my team. That ultimately I'm not frightened of the condemnation of the Trotskyist student union. That ultimately it's a good thing to do a good job at work, but it's not who I am. One of the great temptations of a role like mine is that people are always either telling you that you are brilliant or that you are hopeless. It's a bit like being a politician. Either people are continually telling you that you are the best Vice-Chancellor the world has ever seen, or they are telling you that you are unbelievably wicked. And they're always telling you should be or not doing the right thing. Coronavirus will mean that the University of Sydney will this year lose somewhere between $200 million and $700 million. That's tough. And we've just introduced a whole new series of savings measures to deal with that. Either people will say, oh, this is terrible, they're not going hard enough, you've got to save more money, you've got to be more responsible for the future. Or they will be saying, oh, this is terrible, you can't take any money into this, why haven't they done this? The great thing about my job is that about 3 million people in the City of Sydney love the University of Sydney to death. The bad thing about my job is about 5 million people think they could run it better than the people who are paid to do it. So you're always going to be brilliant or hopeless. And in that context, it's really important to remember that your identity is ultimately secure in the love of God. And therefore, both you can afford to wear the mask and to be unmasked, to both play the role of Vice-Chancellor and also to be Michael with your colleagues, to make sure that there are appropriate boundaries and also to be open to people. And in that sense, to be both authentic in the way that's desired by the romantic impulse in the Western tradition, and also safe in the way that's so valued by the classical tradition. The burden and the brittleness, they're always just underneath the surface. But I think at its best, the fact that Christians are used to living a double life, and that ultimately their identity is secure in Christ, or to give us of all people the toolkits to navigate this difficult and inevitable tension. So that's what I have to say. Thank you very much.